Alright, so we're going to work through this experimental Clovis point, and I have a raw piece of Pedernales, Edwards Plateau chert, and in this instance I'm going to be using a larger billet, which is something I don't normally do when I'm trying to make overly thin points, and that's because I get a little more lenticular shape by lap napping with an antler billet. So that's the specific reason for me starting and using this particular antler billet. So as we reduce mass, one thing as I've been studying Clovis for quite some time is there seems to be, which makes perfect sense, that there is no one standard way in which Clovis points are made. You're talking about a very geographically diverse, time period diverse, realistically, when you're talking about a couple thousand years. So techniques certainly evolved from early to later times. Also the materials being used, the potential tools being used, and the individual manufacturers of these points. So what you're going to have is no set standard way that this is, in quotations, the way that a Clovis point is made, because that's simply not how this works. If you had one maker and one maker only, or one civilization, you know, one tribe of people, say, like we might see with the Folsom culture, it's very, very particular, then you could say, yes, that is in fact how these are made. Clovis is much more diverse, everywhere from running to the ice sheet all the way down to Florida. So I've been studying some of these casts of Clovis from multiple different areas, as well as Clovis preforms and broken Clovis. And so I came up with this nice idea that I wanted to try, because as modern nappers recreate Clovis, more times than not they're trying to seek the classic double flute on one on each side. And you know, realistically, you would talk about your recreation nappers, they want to see one beautiful flute on this side, one beautiful flute on that side, and that seems to be how we classify a modern day interpretation of a Clovis, that you did a good job. But when we're really looking into the archaeological record, what we're seeing is many of these points have one good flute channel, and then on the other side have a couple smaller multiple flute channels, or on both sides they have multiple flute channels. Now on some there are ones that have one beautiful flute channel on either side, but there's just as many that have a single channel and then almost nothing but a little bit of tiny basal thinning with pressure flaking on the other side, or multiple flutes on one side and basal thinning, or one flute with multiple flutes, or just multiple flutes all the way around this thing. So there are so many, and it's not so much about the artistic impression of the point, but rather creating a point that serves a purpose and functions well. And that would be hafting it into a split shaft and just creating a basally thin point to insert into that split shaft, as I've demonstrated before. So I've noticed a couple other characteristics, and as we move through this build, I look forward to seeing how this one works out. See, so what you'll notice immediately from this, it's not reduced nearly enough at all. At this point, it's simply just a preform. But it's extremely lenticular. It's got a very high crown in the center. It's quite thick in the center. And that is achieved best, in my opinion, with this. And it's almost because it's a more rudimentary way of knapping, as opposed to, I believe, what we see a lot more in the archaic knapping, which is going to be this short, stubby, free-handed knapping that tends to run these thin, almost paper-thin flakes nearly across center, or oftentimes well across center. And you will see me use some of this. But what I have personally found, and I think this is easily relatable to primitive man, is that some people are going to use different tools. If I use this, I create a point that is too thin to actually flute. And that's what you see actually more in the archaic times. And so I'm specifically using a more primitive style of percussion knapping for the most part, at least until I get down to this thicker shape that is going to lend itself better to a fluted Clovis point. So let's keep working through it. And I don't want to thin it too much, but we're still need a lot more thinning. And now we are just raising a platform, essentially brushing this down with the back of our antler tine flaker. And now is when I need to potentially thin a little bit better. Now I can accomplish everything without this tool by simply using a hammerstone. However, when I have the tool at my disposal, I tend to use it. So that's a nice flake. You can see how this one ran right across center. It really thinned our piece quite a bit. And I do need to be careful as I continue to work down. In fact, the only reason I'm using this freehand at the moment is because I left it a little bit too thick, because this is raw stone. And so, because when it's raw stone, it is harder to get it super thin, because the flakes simply don't travel as far as when it's heat treated. We got a nice one there. So that's what I love about each, individual point, is different rocks, different tools, different makers, and just depending on the day for the napper, it may depend on the tools that he's using. You may see some tools or some points made by the same exact maker, and they look completely different, because that's just the nature of flint knapping. He'll have a specific style, or she'll have a specific style. So you do tend to find quite a bit of knapping tool remains with women, which is interesting in itself too. It's probably a combination, different cultures, men and women knapping. So in studying the different variations of, say, Western versus Eastern, there are so many variations, and what I've noticed is it's not necessarily a Western versus Eastern or time period. It's an individual maker. If you look at the Clovis from the Colby site that look totally different than anything else, and then you can look at stuff, the one from the Galt site, or from any of these other, the Fen cache, and these points look so different, and that's because the maker is a different person. And so you have to account that there's going to be some variation of technique and tools taking place in each of these builds. So we are at this point in time in which we do need to really start slowing down and concentrating a little bit more now that we're into this preform stage of making a projectile. I need to be very strategic about my hits. Okay, cleaning that up. And because of this particular piece of rock and the fact that it is raw, it doesn't break as easy. Even using the freehand knapping, I'm still exceptionally lenticular. So much so to the point I do need to thin it some more, drastically. And that's what I'm attempting to do now, in trying to be a little bit more strategic with my hits and platforms. Very good. Here, a pitch change. It's going to lead us into a step fracture. If we continue to hit that platform, there's a very distinct pitch change. Much better. Now is where I do want to be a little bit more careful there. I don't want to refine the tip a whole lot at this point, but I do want to refine it a little bit. It's a great opportunity to use this indirect percussion technique. Beautiful. Like I said, I don't want to go crazy with it yet. And this is utilizing a piece of moose antler because it is the closest thing that I have personally found to ivory. And normal deer antler does not hold up to this abuse very, very well. And I think that our paleo peoples had a pretty decent supply of available ivory. And I think similar tools are easily fashioned, especially in the later paleo time, or even transitional, really even after we start losing some of the megafauna, or almost all of the megafauna, I should say, if not all, that there will still be an ivory supply around. But as we see the invention of the drill starting to come on the scene, you don't see the drill a whole lot in paleo times. A little, not a lot. It certainly gets more widespread in the transitional and in the early archaic, but as they start figuring the drill technology out, these should be very, very easy to make. And this is, I'd have to work pretty hard to wiggle it out, but I can actually wiggle this out. It's not glued in, it's simply drilled. And then I have a tapered piece of moose antler, and it is basically forced into there, and it's wrapped with sinew here to keep it from breaking, splitting completely out. And then, of course, the mallet, any sort of mallet can be used, a femur from or even a just a leg bone of a, an ulna, even of a bison would probably be plenty large enough to use, or just a wood mallet for that matter. Little one, a little bit more. There's a little better. And mostly what I've found is exactly what's kind of starting to happen here, or what's been happening, is we have one side that has quite a bit of turtle backing because we used all our best platforms to make it beautiful on this side. And in the past, I've really fought with myself decreasing the size of the point, which I'm going to continue to do. I'll continue to work at narrow to help get rid of a lot of this. But of course, this is part of what the fluting is supposed to do, is help remove some of these features. Now normally it's not quite this distinct of a turtle back. I just let it get a little bit out of control. But let's keep working through a little bit closer to where I want to be on it. I might get another good bit of removal here in a second. What I've also seen is a lot of the Clovis from which I've talked about many times over, the Clovis actually recovered from megafauna kill sites have been quite small in comparison to ones discovered in other places not associated with megafauna kill sites, which also really aligns well with my personal findings of small points penetrate much better because of the lack of resistance compared to the larger points. Okay, I think it's actually doing a little bit opposite now of what I really wanted, but that's part of flint knapping after all, isn't it? Being able to adapt. Now what I really wanted to show you, I wanted to take place actually prior to this, and that was actually fluting the preform, because I left the back get so, this section here gets so turtle backed, I had to try to thin it out a little bit before I tried it. And what's interesting, and I'll have to show you in another video, is that we certainly see a lot of preforms, just bifaces, that have a single flute taken out of it, and that tells me, at least in part, some people are actually fluting points similar to that. That was more of a relief flake than a flute. That they were fluting points before they ever even refined the point out, at least on one side. And so that could explain as to why you could have one side that's beautifully fluted because we have so much more mass to work with, and then the other side is just simply thinned out, or in this case, if it is thick enough, we might be able to flute it fairly well also. We'll just see how it goes. So we're going to set up, at this point, a rudimentary fluting, because it is still very much in the biface form. I actually wanted to flute it a little bit earlier than this, but this is what the stone gave us, and so that's what we're going to work with. And this is a perfect example of simple basal thinning that could result in a flute. And I may very well break the point because I'm using freehand percussion to try to drastically thin this point right now. Okay, so kind of Didn't give me exactly what I was looking for, but it did in fact produce flute. I'm just running into more of a problem here. So, and I think that that's really the lesson to be learned from what I have seen. It's not about making the point and then fluting it. It's about basally thinning, which oftentimes you can get a much cleaner, better flute earlier on in the build process. Here we go. Got that piece of junk off, which actually erased our flute. Got another great piece off there. So the idea, of course, again, is we're thinning the point. We're not trying to create a beautiful point that's fluted on each side and it goes up a certain distance so we can put it in a case or say that we did it. Because when we look at a lot of these casts that they were using, that were found at kill sites, at hunting sites, even at campsites, there are some, and as you work through and do more and more Clovis, some of them are going to just inherently turn out better than others, and you're also going to have some nappers that are inherently better nappers than others. But the true end result, or end goal, not end result, but true end goal, is to simply thin the dang point at the base so it slides into your split shaft. So here we are in that same position again. And this is also another reason that we may see flutes that are off center, because quite literally we have a turtle back here. This side's not that far off from where we need it to be, but this over here is really mounted up. So why would we try to set it up to remove a perfect flute here when we could take this out? Well, some of them, yes, maybe unintentionally, just an accidental hit that fluted it. But there we accomplished exactly what we were looking to do, completely freehand. You can see the nice flute that's right there. And it's got a very slight hinge at the base, which we do often see. Although I do tend to have more feathering out flutes when I use direct percussion, as opposed to hinged flutes when I use indirect percussion. And so, with that in mind, I probably won't mess with that too much. That side's not too bad. There's obviously a very visible flute, but I'm not going for the artistic fluting here. I'm going for functionality, and that's something, again, we see more and more of with different Clovis points. Flutes are oftentimes off-center, because what happens is, especially when you have this more lenticular shape, the lenticular shape comes from, quite honestly, a lesser degree of napping skill. When you're a very, very skilled napper, you tend to run flakes very far across center, and you come up with these very, very flat cross sections. Obviously, they are lenticular in some degree, but especially in your archaic points that are oftentimes much wider. Not always, but in some cases, like Noonan's or Pedernales or any of these, large stemmed-ish type points, that they're very, very flat and very, very thin in some cases, where you don't normally see that with the Clovis, and they're much more lenticular, and so it's just a different means of thinning the point once it's near completion. But as your skill as a napper actually grows, you have to intentionally use techniques and tools, and I think any good napper that does Clovis points will tell you that same exact thing, that you have to almost dumb down your napping ability to create this more lenticular shape that's going to lend itself well to fluting. And with that in mind, I'll go ahead and pop. It's kind of didn't really go too awful far, but it's okay. Part of the process, and that's something, again, where you might see a failed flute that was worked back down. That's why the bases are certainly more concave, is because, quite honestly, they're fluted multiple times until you start producing the basally thinned edge that you're looking for, or the basally end piece that you're looking for. So there you go. That's an indirect flute off to one side. I'll show you that because, again, it's basally thinned. That is exceptionally common to see one, two, and another one up the center. And I do believe it was done pretty much in that exact same manner. Do it again, no special jigs. That one didn't give us as far of one. It is still fluted, but short. So keep work that down and get it right where we want it to get. Okay, I'm actually going to take one off the other side. So remember, the idea in this is we're basally thinning, and the flutes are a byproduct of trying to basally thin efficiently. Nope, don't want to force that one. Not doing anything super fancy here. I'm not creating an extremely well-defined nipple or anything like that. Not like you would see in a falsum point. And I mean, in some occasions, I do create a fairly significant platform. In some cases, I don't. That one's good. Keep working this over. So you got to remember that multiple times you can flute this, but eventually some of your initial flutes are completely covered over, completely erased, and taken out by later flutes. And so that's why you'd say, well, this one's only fluted 3 times. The thing may have been fluted dang 6 times on one side, but the only ones that remain are the 3 that you see. But I actually see many remnants on some of these casts of large flake removal up further than it's noted in the visible flutes. So what I'm inherently doing is I ran another one up that actually failed. That kind of aggravated me a little bit. What I'm doing is inherently making more of a nipple to try to get a better flute off of, just by trying to hit these relief flutes on either side. Now that one of course failed on me, and that's going to be the difference maker of it looking as nice as I wanted. But I still think that we're going to be in a pretty good spot when it's all said and done. And I think that that's the most important takeaway. I'm going to end up busting this ear off anyway, so I'm just going to go ahead and chip her down. Well, probably the most important takeaway of all the stress that I've had in making Clovis points is, instead of trying to marry myself to the idea of we must have one beautiful flute on either side, it's look at the points in archaeology and just find a way to create the point to be as efficient as you could possibly make it, and then compare that to the archaeological record. And that has given me so much more insight than just trying to make a pretty Clovis point. There we go. Drew that other one up. I've seen that so many times where you've got a flute right on the edge, and the reason for that is probably exactly what happened there. I had a failed flute, so I had to come in over here. So now you can see how fast these points can get short if you don't get it right the first time. So you can lose a lot of size on your points. I'm almost tempted to direct percussion that. See what happens. Another one, it went there and it failed again at the same exact spot. And that drives me absolutely crazy. So now our point just got shorter. And that's why some of these flutes you also see, they don't go in very far. It's not always the case. So now what we're going to do is abandon the punch for a second and find my little free hand. And that time we knocked it off. And that time we got it. All but one little extra piece. So tell me you haven't seen that. These multiple flutes running in, and I got this one piece, and I've seen that too on one side of your Clovis point. Now, that being said, we're still not done. We might actually be able to get, I'm not going to bend over backwards, but if it wants to come off nice, I'll let it. If it doesn't, I'm not going to fight it. Fight it a little bit. Nope. Okay, it doesn't want to come off. No problem. So now what I am going to do is, even though the other side was fluted and looked fairly good, now that we've ground enough of it away, not only does it not look so good anymore, which I don't care about it looking good as much as being thin at the base, so we can haft it well. We're going to knock that down. Man, I'm still looking at it like I can still get flutes off the other side. Sometimes this is the most important stuff, is looking at the issues you're running into with these and say, well, it may have worked out, we could have had a longer flute, it would have looked better, it would have done this, it would have done that. Go. Then that side. Let's give us one more. I'm going to end up breaking the ear off of it. There it is. Perfect. So we just fluted that direct percussion on this side, and it thinned it very, very nicely. And that we see quite a bit. So it is thinned out quite nicely. It completely feathers. There's no hinge. That was with direct percussion. And then on this side we have the multiple flutes that hinge with indirect percussion, but I'm not done yet because I know I can get that off without ruining the rest of the point. So, or at least most likely. And I'm not going to force it, but if it wants to go, I'll get rid of it, because while that's not, I don't care how it looks, that is a little bit cumbersome when it comes to hafting the point. Get another good reposition in here, and pop a little one here. Bam, knock it clean off. Done deal. Multiple flutes on this side, singular flute, but you saw, so that we have one singular flute on this side that's completely feathered out, and that was the side that gave me the most trouble, was that side. Then this was the side that everybody would look at and say that that one wasn't done very well. He had to flute it multiple times, and this was actually the one that gave us so much trouble. So now, one thing else that I've seen is, you could say, yeah, the Clovis is done, but it's not. Because while some are somewhat fluted at the end, there's a lot that have the final work done after the fluting has taken place. Now, we're not driving these long thinning flakes in here. We're not going to erase the flutes because we're already thin. But now what we are doing is we are simply refining the edge. And it makes perfect sense that you wouldn't put the time in to refining this edge until the point was at a point in manufacture that it most likely was not going to snap on you. So again, I think I can't really emphasize it enough that this is not about the art of flint knapping. It's not about the manufacture of beautiful points. It's about recreating organically points found in archaeology, where I'm doing what I can to make this point the best it can be. I'm not, for function, not for fashion. And all I was doing was trying to basally thin it, so now it's got a very nice hafting section here that's not all bulked up in the back. Because we had that steep lenticular shape, and then also the, that ugly turtle back that was on the one side that we had to get rid of. Okay, so now go ahead and thin this out a little bit more. And we are going to refine this down a little bit more yet, not a ton, but I want it to be a good style of hunting point. As of right now, this is one that personally I would associate more with a caribou hunting site rather than megafauna, simply because of the size. And as we just work down through a little bit of hafting, kind of beveling on the back side. And one thing also that I've seen that's exceptionally important is when I've looked at casts, I've seen what appears to be very, very beautifully done teeny tiny flakes, done with like a tiny little notcher or a tiny little flaker. And I've also reproduced those using a great big one. And I was almost confused when I did it at first, but it makes a lot more sense. Instead of removing these singular pushing down flakes to remove big ones, it's as we get closer to the end product, I start rolling my flaker, and as I roll it down through, it kind of chatters along, and I get these tiny little flakes that come right off the edge. And I have evidence of those on a cast of a Swanee point that Morgan Smith found in the Swanee River. And it has all on the tip these tiny, it looks like it was completely finished to have a big bull-nosed round front, which didn't make a lot of sense to me given the size of the point. But now as I look and see that those tiny little flakes are not actually the finished product, it was just simply a preform and used probably that rolling technique like I use to generate more power. I now look at it more as a preform than a finished point, but I thought, well, why on earth would they make this rounded front, specifically make this rounded front on this small point that really wouldn't make a good knife? So it didn't make a lot of sense until I reproduced that same look with just a big antler flaker like this one. And at this point, this is a piece that people would find and consider to be very Clovis-ish. And now that I've kind of worked that edge, I kind of ground it to the shape that I want. Now I'm going along and actually pressure flaking the edge as if we were ready to take it on hot. So it's completely preformed out. It's really fully formed. Definitely diagnostic into a fluted point. But see, it's not sharpened at all. It's ground into shape, and the edges are about where I need them. However, if I kept a hold of this and wanted to travel, this is probably the best way to travel with it. And then when it comes time to actually mounting it and hunting with it, I'm going to take a fresh flaker. And this is not super fresh, but it's another flaker that I have, and it's not quite as wide. But I don't want to use this all the time because these wear down. So this is for my final flaking and driving more hunting edge preparation style of flakes. This is where I'm starting to put just a little bit of edge on it. This is before serrations really show up, like with the Daltons. So this was more of a single flake without the detail work in really sharp serrations. One of the things that I'm kind of known for doing are these scary sharp serrations. Now we actually have a fairly sharp edge, and you can see now that it's a finished edge. I'll hold it up so you can see this one side. You can see the difference in that edge, I think, compared to this side. Hopefully. I think that angle shows it better with the shadow. You can see the specific chipping marks here where they're not present up there. So, while this is not, again, the most beautiful Clovis, some of them are going to inherently turn out prettier than others. But when we're looking for function, and like I said, if this was one that I was going to use more so on a caribou hunt, this makes a little bit more sense as opposed to megafauna. I'm not saying I wouldn't throw this, but I would probably choose the slightly smaller piece and refine the tip out just a little bit more. But see, caribou are not as difficult to penetrate, obviously, as a woolly mammoth or a mastodon or any other large animals. Even a bison is significantly harder to penetrate than a caribou. So you can kind of get away with some of these a little bit wider. In fact, I don't know offhand. It doesn't resemble it exactly because the base isn't as concave, but it is an interesting piece to point out because the base on that one is extremely concave, because I ran into the same issues I did with fluting, and it kept working it up, and probably used indirect because it was so concave. I can't think of the name of the point, but I will put it in text on the screen because I'll look it up when I'm done and when I edit this film, because I want you to know it, and then when you see it you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about, and I'll show you a picture of it. So dimensionally, this point reminds me a lot of that point, which was in association with a caribou hunting site. Not necessarily a caribou kill site, but was in association with a caribou hunting site, and the two pieces were actually broken in half, or the point was broken in half, and the two pieces were found quite some distance, like a very long distance, like from hunting ground distance to campground distance from each other, and then later put back together and cast. So right there, that's exactly what we're looking for. I want to really try to give you a good close-up of this. There's our multiple flutes with kind of terminating on these step fractures, which is seen a lot. And then there's also a single flute that's a wide flute. It's quite wide, and it runs and completely feathers itself out. And we still have the lenticular shape in the front, but obviously it's much more knifed edge in the back. So this way it will slide right in perfectly, where if it was up here, you can see how much further, how much wider my fingers are together than they would be here, simply by taking a split shaft and sliding it right up to the first step fracture piece, and you can see how tight this is in comparison to if it was hafted without flutes. So that makes perfect sense. So anyway, there we have it. There is our more authentic, I believe, Clovis reproduction for, like I said, more or less about caribou sized and style of Clovis hunting point.